Once we introduced court specialization, what we found is that women began to use the criminal justice system much more frequently. From 83 to 1990-91, we had the directive to the police to charge. When we put that together with the introduction of the specialized court, you see a dramatic leap in the number of women who are now calling the police, and the police were arresting. So this is not dealing with protection orders, domestic violence, DVOs, is that what you call them here? These are arrests for criminal offenses. So women began to call the police more frequently because they heard about the specialized court. The issue was raised in public attention and awareness, and more people started to call the police, and more police responded by arresting. Some of the characteristics of the suspects: 83% of the suspects are male. There's people who are poor are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, unfortunately, and that's no different in the domestic courts. One of the reasons we think this is the case is that poor women disproportionately call the police. Women who don't have a lot of other resources may have as their only hope calling the police. So I think that what this reflects is the reality that if women do have other options, if they have other choices, they'll probably choose those, because who wants to be involved with the criminal justice system, quite frankly? It's a painful and difficult process. But for women who don't have a lot of resources, calling the police may be the only way that they can stop the escalation of violence. Similarly, if you look at the race of persons involved in the court, you'll find that Aboriginal people are overrepresented by a factor of 3. In the city that I live, 13% of our population are people of Aboriginal origin. 39% of the people in the courts are Aboriginal. Now, national surveys done by Aboriginal women's organizations, done by the government, all kinds of surveys show that Aboriginal women are 3 times more likely than non-Aboriginal women to be assaulted. So unfortunately, I think these statistics reflect the reality that the incidence of domestic violence is 3 times higher. Prior arrest of the suspect, what we see is that, in fact, the people who are getting arrested have a history of violence. If we look at the nature of those prior arrests, 77% of them are for crimes against persons. And of those who have a prior arrest, 51% of them were for a previous domestic assault. 22% for general assaults, and 4% for child sexual or physical assault. So the people who are coming to the attention of the court would be considered high risk to reoffend because they already have a history when they enter the system of reoffense. What are the court outcomes? The majority of the cases result in a guilty plea. A very small percentage go to trial, and overall 52% of them are convicted. I want to say one quick word, if I have time, and that is about guilty pleas. We all know, for those who are in the criminal justice system, without guilty pleas the whole system would fall apart because there isn't enough time for trials in every case. What having specialized prosecutors has introduced in our jurisdiction, which is quite unique and I think very creative of our prosecutors, is what they call testimony bargaining instead of plea bargaining. When a woman hears from her husband, if you testify, I'll go to jail for 2 years, she's frightened and she calls the Crown and says, drop the charges. in our system, what happens if a woman requests that the charges be dropped, and it really isn't her decision, it's the prosecutor's decision, she's asked to first see the victim services worker, and the victim services worker meets with her, hears about her history, talks about her concerns, develops a safety plan, refers her to other services, and then refers the issue to the Crown. If the woman, despite all discussions, is absolutely adamant that she won't testify because she's afraid her husband will go to jail, the Crown will meet with her and say, well, what do you want to have happen? What would be a good outcome for you? And as we all know, for those of us who work in the field, I just want him to stop being violent. I don't want him to go to jail. I don't want him to have a criminal record, et cetera, et cetera. And so prosecutors have two options. And one of the options is the stay with counseling, which is basically a diversion program. The prosecutor will say, okay, we'll have a delayed remand. We won't finish this case if it's a low risk case. If the victim wants counseling more than anything else, the case can be deferred to a counselor. And at the end of a period of treatment, if the accused has attended, participated, and completed the treatment, then the Crown will agree to stay the charges. So it's a form of diversion with a stick, because if they don't attend, don't participate, and don't complete the program, then the Crown can proceed with the case. So that's one option. Testimony bargaining can also involve talking to the victim about the possibility of dropping the more serious charges and bringing in a joint recommendation with defense for 2 years probation and court-mandated treatment. That is often exactly what a victim would want, because she wants him to get the treatment. Typically what happens in these cases, and I studied a series of them, and I would say about a third of our guilty pleas are a result of this type of testimony bargaining, is the victim will say, okay, if you can do that, I will testify. The prosecutor then picks up the phone, says to the defense lawyer, I have a witness. The defense lawyer says, I'll get back to you, and they enter a guilty plea. So the woman doesn't have to testify, but they will get the outcome that they want. And so we have a high rate of guilty pleas, 5 minutes. Okay, I just want to quickly run through this. The sentencing pattern I talked about, so I won't say anything more. I want to talk about victims' perspective of the system. There were some surprises for us in this. First of all, we asked, of the 665 women that we studied, 222 were in Manitoba. So I'm focusing on the Manitoba women. About 77% of the women that we interviewed had involvement with the police. Now, what we find here is that people aren't that happy with police intervention. But it's interesting that when it comes to, and we looked at Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, because there's always that traditional barrier. The Aboriginal people are very suspicious of our justice system because of their history of colonization and persecution. But in fact, when it comes to negative assessments, Aboriginal women are not that much different than non-Aboriginal women. If we look at what they said about police responses, the positive responses all had to do with the police treating them respectfully and providing them with what they needed, being empathetic. And this is so important. As the last person said, he seemed human. Because they appear just as authority figures. And so being treated with compassion and respect is very important. Negative responses are, of course, a result of being felt like they weren't being listened to, were not being respected, and were not receiving the kind of care that they deserved. And then there were mixed and factual, where they just simply said, he came, he did this, he did that, etc., or she. How were you treated by prosecutors? Now, the number of prosecutors that women had contact with are much lower, and that reflects the fact that so many people entered guilty pleas, and consequently the victim didn't necessarily have to deal with the prosecutor. Interestingly enough, Aboriginal women had a much higher estimate of the prosecutors than non-Aboriginal women. Now, we have qualitative information that goes with this, and we're going to try to figure out, was it different expectations? Was it different treatment? What were the factors that, against what we anticipated, Aboriginal women reported a better experience with prosecutors than non-Aboriginal women? The positive, they were good, they were friendly, they were respectful. Or the negative was, again, they just don't listen to me, they don't hear, they don't pay attention. If we look at the judges, how were you treated by the judges? Again, Aboriginal women were much more positive than non-Aboriginal women. And again, this was a bit of a surprise, and we haven't yet done the qualitative data analysis, but we're wanting to look into that to see what the differences were. Again, the positive was he was on my side. He made me feel like I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself. He chastised my husband for being abusive. And the negative, again, I'm just a case, I'm not a person. So we've discovered, and one of the differences I think that exists, and I'm wrapping up, is that in North America, Aboriginal women, in Canada, I'm not sure about the United States, in Canada, Aboriginal women are much more likely to call the police and much more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. And so we have some real challenges around developing culturally appropriate interventions that meet the needs of our Aboriginal sisters. Thank you very much.